hundreds of thousands of asteroids that hit Jupiter. And he said, if you didn't have a planet like that in your solar system and absorbing a bunch of those, one of them would hit Earth.
One did.
Yeah, one, yeah.
I like this cord because it has more than one outlet.
Yeah.
You have to plug it in
Yeah.
first.
Yeah.
If I plug this into the yellow one, it'll turn the lamp off and it'll then take 5 minutes to cool down and bring back up.
Yep.
So you're,
Yeah. There's something wrong with this, if we're not paying attention.
Yeah, yeah.
All of this unusual weather.
Mhm.
Here.
Yeah. Mhm. Oh, yeah.
Let me trace.
Mhm.
glad we're starting with
Yeah.
science one.
Yeah.
Well, as some of you already know, some of the arrangements for this semester's presentations were made fairly recently. In fact, this last week. And so I don't even have a copy of this to read, but I will send, I think I have everybody's email address, and I'll send you a copy so you have the whole fall semester. But Linda Eastwood is correct, my school would be called an adjunct instructor.
Yeah, well, at McCormick we have adjuncts and affiliates, and I think the
You're an
difference is,
affiliate.
I'm an affiliate, which means you're an adjunct and we love you, something like that.
Oh, I feel bad.
Yeah.
Because I was an adjunct before I was
Right.
full-time.
Yep.
But anyway, Bob Caffey's been here a number of times, and he has some rather serious chronic problems that may really interfere with his teaching schedule this fall as well. And so early last week, he wrote to me and said he was deeply sorry that he wasn't going to be able to come, and he knew he was the first speaker and was supposed to start today. And so I checked with a number of people who I know well, including Ken Sawyer. If you remember Ken, he describes himself as the recovering librarian, church historian, and he recommended Linda Eastwood, who I didn't know of because you're not listed on the McCormick page with faculty.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a name that I knew to call, but he gave me her email address, and I had just 4 or 5 days to ask somebody to do a 3-week session. And she said yes. And so I was really tickled.
All right, thank you.
And then she teaches at McCormick, and you work very closely with Anna Case-Winters, who's been here a number of times, and has already been here this year. She came just before Earth Day. And so, we're mighty glad to have you. What's interesting, she has faith in the age of science. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, your bachelor's degree was in physics.
Yeah, I actually have a PhD in physics. That's
And
my
my guess is at that time you had no thoughts of being ordained.
correct. Correct.
And through a series of life experiences, let's call it. Dave, can you put that on another chair so that people don't feel they can't sit there? You have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate.
I've got 1 bachelor's, 4 master's degrees, and a doctorate. I'm crazy.
And one of the degrees was from the University of Aberdeen.
Yeah, 2 of them.
Remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
And she's worked very closely with the accompanying program in Columbia. And if you recall that, and our son participated in that, and she was the national coordinator.
Yeah.
Jake knew her name, and she knows Paige Stephen. And our guest pastor this morning, I went to introduce them, and she said, "Oh, we know each other." So it was just me that didn't. So Linda, thank you very much for coming.
And of course, I mean, I could only do this because I already had this 3-week series prepared. There's no way I could have put it together in no time flat. So I've taught this in other churches. It's also some of the material that Anna Case-Winters and I use when we teach an introductory religion and science course together. And we overlap enormously in our interests, but with 25 years actually working in the medical equipment industry, I'm clearly stronger on the science side, and Anna, with a lifetime in theology, is clearly stronger on the theology side. And then I happen to love history, which you are going to find out as we go through this as well. So we play off our mutual skills when we teach religion and science together to McCormick students. So I just want a sort of general sense. If I were to ask people to vote whether science and religion are enemies, or friends, or who the heck knows, which of those three would you vote for? So who would vote that science and religion are enemies?
Seen as enemies, or?
Yeah.
They are certainly perceived as enemies.
Right.
In
How do
wide circles.
how do you perceive? Do you perceive science and religion as enemies or friends, or I'm really not sure. Enemies? Friends? Really not sure.
Two sides of the same revelation.
Yeah. But as you say, many people see them as enemies. McCormick has a very, very ecumenical student body, and it's interesting to see which students choose to take the course in religion and science, because some of them actually do start believing that they are total enemies, especially evolution. Shock, horror. So yeah, it's an interesting time. And in fact, McCormick just got a grant from the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. They've chosen a limited number of seminaries from those who applied to help us develop not just a religion and science course, but to integrate a bit more science thinking into basic theology classes so that everybody gets a taste of the interaction. And I think that's particularly appropriate because, as I'm going to talk about today and in the next couple of weeks, faith and science have always closely interacted, whether people have acknowledged it or not. So we're going to do this over 3 weeks, and I'm going to choose different topic areas that really kind of sort of start from the science findings. So the first will be cosmology, the universe. The second will be who we are as humans, so more biology and then geology, finding fossils and all that stuff. And then finally, some of 20th century physics and what that's done to understanding the relation between faith and science. So a little bit more background on yours truly, because yes, I do have this sort of complicated background of having spent 25 years working as a physicist and a research manager and a business manager, having been in the right place at the right time to be in at the birth of magnetic resonance imaging. So that was my career. And about 15 years into a 25-year career, I decided that, in another 10 years, this was going to be just another business. It wasn't going to be quite so exciting anymore, and I would do something else. But I absolutely did not think that I'd end up where I ended up. I had no plan to go to seminary, but God has a great sense of humor. So seminary it was, and I've never looked back. And I thought I would end up probably as a multicultural minister, as a perhaps sort of social outreach minister in some kind of multicultural congregation. That was my thought. And maybe I did, but it wasn't kind of the way I thought, because I was actually ordained to coordinate the Columbia Accompaniment Program, a partnership between the church in this country and the church in Columbia, walking alongside them as they do human rights work with people who've been displaced by violence. So I did that for a few years, but I had the chutzpah to ask McCormick if they'd give me an office to do that, because it was a no fixed abode job, and they did, and the rest is history, because I got sucked into teaching and love it. So that's what I spend most of my time doing, teaching at McCormick. Religion and science, yeah, both seekers after truth, after wisdom, in different ways at different times and places. And my sort of thesis, and it's not an original one, is that the two have always influenced each other. If I say science and theology have always influenced each other, I'm being sort of ahistoric, because the word science just used to mean knowledge, and the word scientist actually was only developed in the 19th century by William Hoyle, who introduced the word as a way of talking about people who study nature. So the word scientist is not very old at all. But if you accept that science or natural philosophy have always influenced each other, then that is very definitely true. And I should just put as an aside, I did my graduate physics work in Aberdeen, in the medical physics department, Aberdeen, Scotland. But the main physics department was not called the physics department, it was called the Department of Natural Philosophy. Natural philosophy. So there are people talk about the relationship between them, and in fact I saw earlier you've got Ian Barber's book on religion and science on your shelf up there, and he introduced this sort of four-way system of talking about the relationship between them. And it's not that any one of these always applies, but I'm sure we can think of times and places where science and religion have seemed to be in conflict. There are definitely people who say, what's the problem? They're totally independent, they never need to interact with each other, which usually doesn't work. But that's one way of looking at it. There's one way of looking at it is that they can be in dialogue, and the other is that they can totally come together. So those are kind of a way of characterizing it. When we look at science and religion, there's a couple of ways of looking at them. One is to look at their findings and how those conflict, and that's really what I'm going to be spending most of the time doing. But the other way is thinking about their methods. How do they work? And people tend these days to think that the scientific method and religious thinking are so far apart that there's no way they could even be talking to each other. But that's actually not totally the case. So in religion, when we try and talk about how do we come to have the ideas that we have, how do we come to know what we know, if you think about it, we have scripture, sure, but we also have a lot of tradition. Otherwise, why would different denominations have different ideas? It's based on their traditions going back. We have our own personal experience. You know, do we actually feel that when we pray we are in communication with God? And that is an experience that says, okay, I believe this. And then we think. We have minds to think with. So the Methodists have this quadrilateral that everybody kind of uses that says this is how we know things in religion. And if you think about it in science, experience, experiments, tradition, you'd better fit with what's come before, or have a darn good reason for saying things have changed. You know, if you're Albert Einstein, you can do that, but most people can't. That you have your scripture, which is the written text from before, and very definitely you use your reason. So it's not quite as different as we sometimes tend to think. But I'm going to concentrate on the findings, and today it's going to be mostly cosmology, which is the study of the origins, the structure, the dynamics, and the fate of the entire universe. Next week will come down to us, but today we'll start big. And I'm not really going to talk about the fate much, although that's one of the topics we do talk about with students when we come to eschatology, which is the study of the end times. What does it mean that the Earth is not going to last forever, for instance? But we're not going to cover that right now. But so how has our cosmology changed through history and interacted with our understanding of God? And I'm going to go all the way back, because I love history, and because it's distinctly relevant, to the ancient Israelites and other influences on the Bible. So we'll start with Old Testament times. And remember that for some people, the biggest conflict between religion and science is if you read, for instance, Genesis 1 as a literal account of creation. I'm going to come back to Bible accounts of creation in a moment. But the biblical concept of the universe, which is often drawn this way, was not just a sort of random, pulled out the air. It was based on, one could say, the best science of the time. The most ancient science is probably astronomy. Watching the stars, because remember, people have thought forever that the stars influenced what's going on down here. And if you looked at the stars, no telescopes, remember, then why not assume that they were scattered on a half dome above a flat Earth? That kind of made sense in terms of what you could see at the time. So if you could even regard some of the biblical accounts of the creation and of the structure of the universe as being in some ways the best science they could possibly do. Not unreasonable. In fact, it came from other cosmologies of the period. There were many, many influences. Poor old Israel got overrun by empire after empire after empire after empire, and they all had their own cultures and they all had their own creation stories. And Israel was influenced by all of them. I'm not going to go through Assyrian, Median, Babylonian, Egyptian, Persian, but they all influenced. And we can see this, for instance, if we look at the multiple creation stories in the Bible. You've had Ted Hebert speaking out here, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the things Ted Hebert says when he's talking about Genesis and the editing that put together different pieces of that book is that the editor who put Genesis 1 at the beginning, that was probably the most powerful editing decision that has ever been made in terms of influence on thinking thereafter. Because there are many creation stories in the Bible. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, if you read them carefully, are different. There are creation stories in Psalm 104, in Job, in other Psalms, in Proverbs. There's many scattered around the Bible. They don't necessarily agree with each other in terms of scientific observation. They do agree with each other in terms of underlying theology. So they took the creation stories or the cosmologies that were around at the time and put a different theological spin on them. So, for instance, I'm going to take the Job one, which I happen to particularly love. I used to hate Job, now I love it. And in the story that God tells to Job, when Job demands that God talk to him directly, and God does, and to Job's somewhat discomfort, it talks about God creating not just all of nature, but including sea monsters like Leviathan. What's important about that is that in other cosmologies, the gods had to fight against these powerful sea monsters. They didn't create them, they fought against them. In the Hebrew interpretation of all those stories, they knew there was one God. That God made everything. Ergo, Leviathan played in the sea for God. Leviathan was not the enemy of God. Leviathan was a creation of God. And you can go through Babylonian, Egyptian. You can see, I mean, in Psalm 104, there's an almost parallel hymn to Artem. So, you know, if you think this was created totally independent of the cultures around it, kind of hard to defend that, and yet the theology is very definitely that of one God who created everything. So what do we get from ancient Hebrew cosmology that's going to give us problems later? So we have the Earth is the center of the universe. That's going to be an oops. Earth was created, it had a beginning, That's going to be rather nice when the Big Bang comes along. God brings order. So God is in control. We're not fighting Leviathan, God is controlling Leviathan. And God acts in the world. Another one that's going to be problematic, and we'll come back more to this next week, but this week as well, once made, things don't change. And that's not always really very explicit, but it's what people seem to have read into the Bible stories for a long time. You know, things are created, they don't change.
Thomas Jefferson thought that dinosaurs, and not so much dinosaurs, but mammoths,
Yeah.
still existed someplace in North America.
Yeah, must do.
Had to, because God created them and he wouldn't let them become extinct.
Yep. Yep. Extinction was a shock when that was realised. And if you even go back to the 4th century St. Augustine, he actually had some ideas that are more congruent with modern science than some of the other folks around him. But he had this idea that God created the seed of every creature at the same time. So maybe the seed would wait a while before it came into creation. But it was already made. It wasn't dependent on anything that came before. It was just ready to come into existence. Humans are the dominant life form. That's caused problems, but probably more because of what we've done to the rest of creation than anything else. And then God is the ultimate cause of everything. So let's move on to New Testament times and the early church. And we now have the Greek Empire and then the Roman Empire. So Greek influence throughout the Roman Empire affects how New Testament writers and early Christians think. An ancient Greek cosmology, if you go back to the time of Plato and Aristotle, there was this kind of struggle between everything as totally random acts of the gods, and they were not particularly well behaved, and they fought each other, and you never knew what was going to happen next, against a system that said, yeah, there could be gods out there, but basically it's an orderly system. It obeys some kind of law. So you've got this sense of it's orderly, we'll call that the science, and who knows, it depends what the gods decide to do next. So that's a sort of science and religion tension, but not really. By the way, they did, for those who don't realise, the ancient Greeks realised that the earth was round. They realised the earth was a sphere. Columbus did not figure that out. It was known long before, partly because you could see the shadow of the earth on the moon in a lunar eclipse. But perhaps most important for the later development of Christianity, for Aristotle there was a prime mover, the ultimate being in all creation. And if you happen to want to adapt Greek philosophy to Christianity, there's where you're going to hang your hat. Aristotle's prime mover. And that world influenced greatly the world of early Christian thought, got kind of absorbed. Also, a lot of it got lost. Early Christian cosmology in popular thinking would have been angels and demons. In more intellectual thought would have been Greek philosophy, but they tended to keep hold of sort of the logic and the ethics and lost a lot of what we would now call science or the natural philosophy. So science was regarded as important primarily insofar as it served the faith. And for instance, one of the ways it served the faith was figuring out when Easter was. Anybody know how we decide how that strangely moving Easter feast is? Okay, who knows the definition? Okay.
It's the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox.
Excellent. So you've got a
That's
mixture.
the Western
Yes.
Easter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, we've got the Orthodox Church has a different. It's crazy. And of course, if you read your Bible, it ought to move with Passover because after all, you know, that's and it doesn't. So we all have our own definitions. But the definition that the Western Church uses is absolutely dependent on both the lunar calendar and the solar calendar. I told you astronomy was the most ancient science. It's been tied to religion forever, in different ways, in different religions. But even in Christianity, we are tied to both the lunar and the solar calendars and need to understand the stars and the sun and the moon. So that piece of science was kept, but actually a lot of Greek science was totally lost to Christianity. And if it weren't for the Muslim world, we wouldn't have it. It was actually the Islamic Empire, which was pretty large in its heyday, that adopted a lot of Greek philosophy and kept alive that tradition of Greek philosophy. So when I say that Greek philosophy influenced the Christian church in its scientific form, it actually did so via the Islamic Empire. We're a lot more ecumenical and interfaith than we think we are, frequently. So in the Middle Ages, the 13th century, and Thomas Aquinas is just the most famous of the Christian thinkers who got in touch with Muslim thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes, and there was a lot of interaction in Spain because both Christians and Muslims were present in Spain at that time. And this interaction led to the rediscovery by the Christians, the Muslims didn't need to rediscover it, rediscovery by the Christians of Aristotle's science. And Thomas Aquinas, he read this rediscovered Aristotle and integrated Aristotle's worldview into Christianity. And Aristotle's prime mover was also Aquinas' God. The prime mover did things like moving crystalline spheres, because there were these Earth at the middle, there were these crystal spheres around it that carried the planets and the stars, and outside is the kingdom of heaven, the abode of God and the elect. And they need somebody to move them. We'll even come back to that idea with Newton. And Aristotelian physics got totally integrated into Christian thinking. In the medieval universities, as universities started to be founded, if you wanted to study theology, you studied science first. I totally approve. But yeah, it was part of your base education. Before you were allowed to touch theology, you had to study Aristotelian science. And I'm not going to go into this one in great detail, but there are reasons why, if on religious grounds you attacked anything to do with Aristotle, you were also really pulling the mat out of, if on scientific grounds you attacked Aristotle, you were attacking a whole system. So if you wanted to attack one piece of it and say, well, the Earth isn't the center of the universe, you've destroyed an entire system of physics, and you'd better be able to rebuild it. Because, for instance, why does anything drop? If I'm not going to do it, but if I let go of this, it will go down. Why? Because according to Aristotle, it was being pulled to its natural pull towards the center of the Earth, not because there was a physical pull, but because that was its nature. It's a matter, it wants to be with the rest of matter. It was tied in with this idea of final cause. All natural things tend to goals or ends. They've got goals built into them. A seed has a tree as its goal, it's built into it. There were ideas of air and fire tend up, earth and water tend down, and down means towards the center of the universe, which is the center of the earth. Ideas like there are totally different rules for everything that happens on earth and everything that happens in the heavens.
Just a sidelight, there's a very artistic winery out in California.
Yeah.
They make about 206 packs a year. It's called Quintessence, and it's built sort of into not a side of a hill, but a mountain. And
Right.
It's all granite. It's all, and they talk a lot about what we were just talking about, the elements. And last time I looked, it was selling for about $1,200 a six-pack.
I probably won't be buying it. What does quintessence mean now? Anybody ever use that word? It's kind of the ultimate essence of something, what it really is, it's the quintessence. What it actually meant in Aristotle's time was the fifth element. So on Earth we had earth, water, air and fire, but things up above they were made when Galileo started seeing mountains on the surface of the moon. This was problematic. It's supposed to be nice, pure, smooth, unblemished stuff. So this got completely integrated into Christianity, and I'm grossly oversimplifying here because there were parts of Aristotle that at times were considered to be heresy and parts that were acceptable. But if you take it as a sort of big picture, Aristotle had been integrated into Christianity, and if you spoke against Aristotle, you were speaking against Christianity, and that could be quite painful, depending on. And from a scientific perspective, as I say, if you demolish one piece of it, you demolished all of it. Then came this guy called Nikolai Copernic, or as we normally call him, Copernicus, who was a very devout Polish Christian, worked for the church, did a lot of astronomy work to serve the church. All this stuff like figuring out when Easter was and all that kind of stuff. He wanted a simpler system than this Ptolemaic system with its crystalline spheres, which had a lot of other complications on it. You had things moving on these spheres, but then actually doing little rotations around the sphere. It was horribly complicated, but it worked. Ptolemy's system did work in terms of predicting. He wanted to get a simpler system, and he realized that he ought to be able to get there with the sun at the center rather than the earth. Couple of problems actually with the story that he definitely proved that the sun, not the earth, was the center of the universe, actually the solar system. Actually, his system didn't end up being any simpler than Ptolemy's, mainly because he assumed that things moved in circles, and they don't, they move into ellipses, and Kepler worked that out later, and then it became a beautifully simple predictive system. He did delay in publishing his results because he realized they were a little bit controversial, moving the earth from the center. And it actually was some Lutherans who got him published, which tells you something about the times he's in. If we have Lutherans around, we must have had the Reformation. Mm-hmm. So the Catholic Church is feeling attacked. So you don't want to add to that attack. So Copernicus, yeah. So Copernicus's work actually wasn't published until he was on his deathbed, and even then, somebody, not him, put in a piece at the beginning that said, this is just a system for calculating when, eclipses and solar events are going to happen. Don't worry, it's not trying to actually prove that the Earth isn't the center, which is, Copernicus knew by then that the Earth wasn't the center, but it was like, let's not make too much trouble. Then, of course, comes along Galileo, the next century. And he didn't invent the telescope, but he certainly improved it, started to use it, and said Copernicus was right. And again, the story of Galileo often gets very oversimplified in that he knew the Earth wasn't the center, the church said it was, for that reason he was locked up in jail forever. Well, A, he wasn't locked up in jail, but he was put under house arrest. Two, he didn't actually get as far as he might have liked in proving that the sun was at the center. He got a long way. He got some things wrong, like he figured out how the tides worked, and he was totally wrong. But he took us a long way towards proving that we lived in a heliocentric system. He also tended to be pretty bullheaded about trying to prove his point. So you take a Catholic church that is already feeling threatened, and you write a work in the form of a dialogue in which the obvious wise person knows that the sun is at the center, and this idiot called Simplicus believes that the earth is at the center, and you put into Simplicus's mouth many of the words of your former friend, Pope Urban. This is not good diplomacy. And it's as much for his way of interacting with the church as for anything else that Galileo got himself into trouble. So he's taken us a long way, not all the way, but a long way to really thinking that we're in a heliocentric system. And I'm just going to sort of digress for a moment on decentering humanity, because some people find this quite disturbing, and I don't. But we have to accept, understand how much we've been decentered in the last 400 years, and especially in the last 100. So now we understand, just thinking in terms of the solar system, that we're the third planet from the sun. And I didn't bring the props to do this, but when I'm working with theology students, I'll take along an orange and a mustard seed, and I'll get one person to stand with the orange in their hand, and get the other person to hold the mustard seed and walk 30 really long paces. That's the sun. This is the earth. We are tiny, even if we only think in terms of the solar system. And of course, we started realizing that we're a blue dot when we saw the Earth from Apollo in '68, and I think that was a sobering point for many people, to kind of see this as a fragile blue dot in space that we better be a bit more careful about than we seem to have learned to be. And then Voyager 1 was the first space probe to actually get out of the solar system. And this is a picture from 1990 looking back towards Earth. We're just on the edge of the solar system at this point. We're not out in another, not even across the galaxy. It's a reminder of just how small Earth is in terms of the universe. This is an image of the Milky Way from an observatory. This is clearly an artist's impression because we haven't been this far outside the galaxy. But if this is our galaxy and we are here, that red dot is not Earth, it's everything you can see with the naked eye. That's that little bit of our one galaxy. We actually can see some other galaxies, they look like stars, but of our own galaxy, that's what we really see. And it took till the 1920s. There'd been some discussion before the 1920s about whether some of these funny, fuzzy things that we saw in the sky, what were they? And the predominant theory is that they were something within our galaxy, and that our galaxy was the universe. And it took till the 1920s to prove that they were a lot further away, and that there were lots of galaxies. So this is within the last 100 years that we've realized that our galaxy is not the whole universe. And you know, the fact that there are a couple of hundred, billion stars in the galaxy, a couple of 100 billion galaxies in the universe, it kind of puts things in perspective. And theologically, it has to make you think about what's God the God of? The Earth or the universe? And then what does that mean in terms of how God acts, of how God relates to us as humans? There's some profound thinking to do based on this. I'm going to go back to the 17th century, which, although we haven't yet got the word scientist, is when what's known as the modern scientific method is born. When you, to simplify, you take observations, you use them to form a theory, but you darn well better test that theory. So observation to theory had been around since Aristotle, but the idea that once you form that theory, these people that you thought as being the lowly kind of scientists, what we would call scientists, were just technicians, philosophers who lived in the thought world. The idea that you really had to go back and test those ideas is primarily a 17th century idea. And we get people like René Descartes and Leibniz and Galileo and Newton. And Newton, I mean, I'm English, so of course I think Newton was special, but he was pretty darn special. He was a sort of Christian, although he had some pretty way out ideas. Way out enough that Cambridge University had to make an exception, because to teach in a university at that time you had to be an ordained minister. That's how close church and state were. And Galileo's ideas on Christianity were so way out and tied to numerology that was not going to work. So they made an exception for him and let him become faculty without being ordained. He really carries forward the work of Copernicus and Galileo, and comes up with the science, primarily gravity, relevant to us, and a whole load of other things too, that holds the whole thing together and proves that the laws of gravity that apply here also apply out in the heavens. Remember, Aristotle thought the heavens worked under a completely different set of rules and things couldn't change. Newton said, they work under the same rules. I can take the same gravity that drops his mythological apple into his head and use them to calculate the orbits of the moon, the orbits of the planets. It's all the same rules. God is still in the picture, but in two ways now. I mean, for Newton and his contemporaries, God clearly set the whole thing going. But for Newton, you also needed God to kind of adjust things. So remember back to Aristotle's prime mover, who had to move those crystalline spheres around? Well, when Newton worked out his planetary dynamics, he thought they weren't quite stable and that things would start to fly off in different directions unless God intervened, just to keep things on the right path. So we have what theologians today with a certain horror call God of the gaps, which is I can't explain it scientifically, so God must have done it. Which is very worrying, because when science then explains it, you go, oh, where was God in this? So we're setting ourselves up in the time of the scientific revolution for some potential real conflict, even though many of the folks who did the science in this period were perfectly good Christians and didn't see any conflict. The first one perhaps who set that conflict going is Pierre Laplace, who carried Newton's work further on the planetary systems, and it is said that Napoleon read one of his treatises, I don't know whether this is true or not, and said to Laplace, I don't find God anywhere in your theory of how the heavens work. And Laplace is reputed to have said, Sire, I had no need of that hypothesis. In other words, I can explain all of this without invoking God. So, question mark, has God been misplaced? Certainly theology and then philosophy tend to part ways from science. Theology tries to respond to this idea of a clockwork universe, just keeps running according to the rules, and ideas of man as a machine. And we get a bunch of challenges to faith. I mean, if nature just keeps running, why do we need God? We certainly don't need Aristotle's telos, this idea of a lure, for the seed to have this feeling of its lure to being a tree, this idea that as well as efficient cause, which is my hitting that hand, there is this sort of yearning telos cause, which for Aristotle was key, and it's getting lost at this time. We have laws of nature that determine everything, that if we actually knew where every particle is right now and the law of nature, we ought to be able to predict everything that is ever going to happen. Of course, we don't know that well, but in theory, if we knew that well. And we get this development of scientism or materialist naturalism that says science will explain everything. And this sets up a lot of conflict, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, between religion and science. And even history tries to become scientific, proving theories of how things happened over time. Higher criticism comes to the Bible, trying to think about the Bible in more carefully logical ways. And for some people who were fighting this attempt to bring science and religion together, it really got particularly darn annoying when Bible scholars started talking about historical criticism and the context in which things happened and who wrote what. They saw that as being as much of an enemy as science. And so there were all these tensions going on. There were a number of responses at the time. One was what is called Deism. So we, assuming everyone in this room is actually a Christian, are theists. A deist, does anybody remember, there used to be an old Sears advert for Sears household appliances, which had we had the repair guy sitting there next to his dog. And the message in the advert was that if you bought a Sears appliance, it would never need repairing. So the repair guy, was it Maytag?
Maytag.
Okay. Thank you for correcting me. And for the deists, God existed, but God was kind of like the Sears or the Maytag factory guy, and then became the Maytag repair guy. God set it all going, set the rules in place, and then just left us all to it.
What did he do when we had these world wars?
Oh, well, I mean, God had just set it going. The rest was up to the system to abide by its rules, and up to us to. God wasn't in the picture, basically. And many, if not most, of the founding fathers of the US were actually deists, not theists. So when people talk about us being a Christian country, there is a slight problem if you go back to the founding fathers, because most of them actually believed in a God that set things going and then was not in the picture. And there's a number of people who can go along with that idea today. It's certainly not an idea that's died. There was another approach, which was the liberalism of people like Schleiermacher, that said, you know, we've got the science, we need to accept it. We will completely adapt our religious thinking to whatever science says. That's an oversimplification, but it'll do. Another was Karl Barth's neo-orthodoxy, which says revelation trumps reason. So whatever God has revealed is and he wasn't a fundamentalist, but he still believed that what God had revealed to individuals in the church was more important than what we were discovering through science. One that I think is perhaps the most worrying to me is the one that says science has the facts, we have the facts. So you get the scientism, which is science can prove it all, and you get the literalism of the Kentucky's, what do they call that museum? There's the Ark down there and the Creation Museum, which says the Bible is the literal scientific truth, and anything that contradicts that is evil. So you've got these two poles that say, I'm right, and you're wrong. I'm right, and you're wrong. There is a local rabbi, and I can't remember his name, and I haven't yet read the book, but I love the title of his book, which is, You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. Which I think is a very important insight. And there is another piece, another sort of layer in Pentecostalism of accepting the supernatural as being very, very real. Pentecostals weren't originally fundamentalists, they didn't originally reject science, some now do. I think I've got time to tell the kettle story, and then we'll have questions. There is my response, and it's not mine originally, it's many people's response, that says there are levels of explanation. So I'll tell you the tea kettle story in a minute, but first we'll do an incredibly complex experiment that I asked the students to do, which is, will each of you please raise a hand? You don't have to. And then I say, so how did that happen? I mean, you clearly, there's muscle dynamics, there's chemistry going on in the muscles, there's the physics of the muscles, but that doesn't totally explain what just happened. I had an idea, I suggested something, some of you resisted it, some of you accepted it, and based on that transfer from mind to mind of ideas, the hand got raised. It's kind of parallel to a story that the Episcopal priest physicist John Polkinghorne tells, and that's why the tea kettle's here. So he's very British, so of course it has to be tea. So in John Polkinghorne's telling, I look out my window and I perhaps see Ken coming. I see him from a distance, and I think he's going to come and knock on my door. So I put the tea kettle on the stove, and Ken gets to the door and he sees the tea kettle and he says, "Oh, why is the kettle boiling?" Well, I could reply, because the gas underneath it is burning. Flames emit heat. The heat is transmitted through the metal in the base of the kettle to the water, which is heated up until it's got to a phase transition point. That's perfectly accurate. Why would I not answer that way? Because it doesn't make any sense, because there's other levels of explanation that actually are more relevant in this case. And as he says, the explanation is, I saw you coming and I thought you might like a cup of tea. Right? Those two do not contradict each other. You don't have to be wrong for me to be right. These are different layers of explanation. And we'll come back to that, the idea of layers of explanation and how maybe some 20th century physics has made that a little more easy to accept. We're going to follow the history trail a bit further. Next week with 19th century science, we're looking at geology and biological evolution and the challenge that put to the idea that the Earth had been created right at the beginning and hadn't really changed. And then the following week we'll come on to 20th century science, to things like quantum mechanics and relativity, but also chaos theory, which is and in some ways has perhaps allowed science for some people to become a little more religion friendly. But I will just leave the topic this week and take any questions. Cosmology, we have discovered so much, amazingly much in the last 100 years. But in the centuries before that, we gradually built up more and more knowledge, and it's been taking off. Zwingli, who was one of the reformers, had a saying that I and many people love, which is the truth, wherever it is to be found, is from God. And so, for me, one of the definitions of a scientist is somebody who studies nature. You could also put that, if you are so inclined, as somebody who studies God's creation. And I can read the heavens as telling the glory of God. I can read Psalm 8 verses 3 to 4 in two different ways. I can read it as when I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established. What are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care from them. You could read it as a despair that we've become so tiny, why should God even notice us? Or you can read it as, wow, you've made all this and you still care about us. And I'll leave you on that note. Questions, comments?
One of my favorite books is The World Lit Only by Fire by William Manchester.
Okay.
And it describes the Middle Ages and then what happened coming out of that. And it's and he writes so well. And it's just a fascinating book to think about what life was like there.
Right. And I think
time.
when I talked about how you can think about religion and science, I've talked about methods, I've talked about sort of outcomes, but there is the whole social milieu in which they are working, which is going to influence how people think. And that's been changing over time. The Middle Ages were a phenomenal time for change.
You touched on it just a bit, but I visited the Creation Museum this summer with a touring group. The retired teachers went down there to see Noah's Ark. And I was amazed at how slanted that place is. Wow. If you're not a fundamentalist, you might as well not go. Don't you think it's?
I have actually not been there yet. It's on my to-do list.
Well, they have the posters next to each other all the way through.
Yeah.
The Bible says this, and science says this, and
I gather some pretty nasty.
They're just diametrically opposed all the way through, and it's just science is completely wrong and we're completely right, and I didn't expect that at all.
Yeah. Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, I know, takes at least some of their students to that museum, and their rule is, as you're going through, you just look. You are not allowed to make mocking comments. Do not comment on anything. Just go through it and look, and we'll talk about it when we get back.
And the other thing that surprised me was it was just full of Amish people.
Sorry?
It was full of Amish people.
Yeah.
With their whole clan,
Yeah.
All the kids from teenagers or adults down to babies. The whole
Interesting.
family was going through.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, it's geographically in the right place for that, but I hadn't realised that piece.
I just finished reading for the second time, I think the title is Astrophysics for People in a Hurry,
Okay.
and it's written by somebody who's an astrophysicist apparently.
Yeah. Is that the Neil deGrasse Tyson one? I know it's on physics. Okay, yeah.
He
writes well.
saying 4.5 billion years ago is when the Big Bang happened, and it happened from a concentration.
No, so the 4.5 is when the Earth formed.
4.5 billion
13.8 is when the Big Bang happened.
Okay, so,
But yeah,
but he said it came out of something that is a trillion times smaller than the period at the end of the seconds. And in 1 billionth of a second, the 4 laws of physics were created. Faster than you can blink your eye. Electromagnetic.
Right. The nuclear force, the weak force.
All that, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, if, I believe that to be true, and I can still hold the creation stories, I can still hold Abraham, I can still hold all of the things in my sort of a steady state, if you will.
Right.
And they don't seem to contradict.
Right.
And-
If you read Genesis 1 as a literal 7-day account, which is different from the other creation accounts in the Bible, but if you read it as a literal 7-day account, you may have problems with that. Although people do have developed kind of clever ways of making them work together. But yeah, for many people, like you and like me, it's not a problem. Why did it happen in the first place? And in fact, do any of you know the story of how the Big Bang got the name, the Big Bang? No. Any of you heard of the British astronomer Fred Hoyle?
Yeah.
Fred Hoyle was very definitely atheist, and also had very strong scientific theories of an eternal universe. He did not believe that there had been this start. And when people started putting together ideas of a universe's beginning, he was doubly skeptical. He was scientifically skeptical, but he also hated the idea because he figured that Christians would jump on it to say there was a beginning of the universe. See? And he said, that stupid Big Bang theory. And he introduced it as a way to be rude about it, and it caught on. It stuck. And it was happily adopted.
What was the number that went with that?
The timing?
Yeah,
13.8 billion years ago?
I thought you said that was the beginning of everything.
Yeah, that's the Big Bang, 13.8.
That's the beginning,
That's
Okay.
the Big Bang.
but we
I
don't
thought
know.
I thought the Big Bang was the beginning of Earth.
No, the Big Bang is the beginning of everything.
Everything, okay.
Everything.
And we don't know what happened before the Big Bang.
If there was a before.
There could have been a universe and it condensed
Yep.
to that
And-
singularity,
What
and then
evidence-
another Big Bang.
what kind of
And there's
evidence
no way to know what happened
for
before
that
that.
number?
Yeah.
Anything like carbon dating?
No, you can't carbon date that, but you can see. I mean, if you something to think about during this week when you go outside at night, look at the stars.
We can't see them.
I know. Well, when get out somewhere where you haven't got so many street lights on an uncloudy night and look at the stars. I have a friend who lives outside Santa Fe, and it's just awesome. You go up on his roof at night and just what is totally different. But you know, you are looking back in time. So even the light from the sun takes 9 minutes to get to us. So when we look, well, don't look at the sun, but when you look at the sun out the corner of your eye, that light left 9 minutes ago. So if the sun exploded, we wouldn't know about it for 9 minutes. We sure know about it then, but not for 9 minutes. The nearest stars, the nearest galaxy is several light years away. So even looking at the nearest galaxy, we are looking back in time. We are looking at what happened several years ago. And you can look further and further and further and out. We can't look back to the Big Bang itself, partly because for that very, very first period, light couldn't even escape this kind of crazy fireball. It was, if you were a photon, you just couldn't escape. But from a couple of 100,000 years after the Big Bang, there is this radiation still left over, filling the universe, getting cooler and cooler, which is now known as the cosmic microwave background radiation. And people map it, and you can see effectively the distribution of matter in the universe as close to after the Big Bang as we're ever going to see with light. There is all kinds of evidence that, and who knows, somebody might find something radically different that disproves all of this, but so far every bit of evidence, and there's a lot of it, points to a Big Bang 13.8 roughly billion years ago.
And everything is moving away from us.
Yeah.
Redshift.
Yeah. So that was part of the 1920s
Hoyle's.
work. As much it was, oh heavens, my brain's just gone. Henrietta Swan Leavitt was a computer. Computers didn't used to be electronic things. Computers used to be people. Henrietta Swan Leavitt should have got a Nobel Prize, but instead she was a very low-paid technician. And by the time anybody actually thought of giving her a Nobel Prize, she'd already died from breast cancer, which is kind of sad. But she's one of the people who gave us ideas as to how to measure distances out into space. And then Hubble, who she worked with, calculated some of the distances and gave us this sense of distance. And I've lost where my thinking was going, my apologies. But gave us the sort of, yes, thank you. Anybody notice that when an ambulance goes by, and I think maybe British ambulance sounds are better than American ones for this, but something comes towards you and it goes, that effect?
The train whistle.
The train whistle will do
We
it.
have a lot of trains around here.
Train whistle will do fine. So it's because those sound waves are kind of getting compressed and then getting elongated. I mean, they aren't, but your hearing of them is, because they're moving away as they're being formed. Same thing happens with light. So light can get shifted towards the red or towards the blue, the violet, depending on whether the object it's coming from is coming towards you or moving away from you. And based on that, it was figured out that the universe is expanding, that everything's moving away.
One more
Where do they
question
think
help me
heaven
out.
They.
You have to decide for yourself. I don't see why it should be. I don't see why it should be in a separate space. I personally think it's all around us. But everybody, it's one of the reasons. Not that question among many is one of the reasons I think this idea that you can keep science and religion totally independent is misguided. But they challenge each other and make us think. One more question, and then I know.
He talks about things happen before 1,000 degrees Kelvin and after. Give me a sense of what 1,000 degrees Kelvin means.
Blooming hot. Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't be around to see it.
I know that.
And I actually don't know what the temperature is at which plasma ceases to be plasma. But when I talked about light not even escaping, I'd have to look up what temperature that was. But the point is that if you get something hot enough, it turns into a plasma where there's no longer any matter in the sense we think of. There's protons and neutrons and electrons and photons in a soup, all bashing against each other so hard that they really can't get out. And that is the initial state after the Big Bang. And everything comes from that. So we from the Greek idea of nothing changes, or the Hebrew idea of God made everything and nothing changes, we have a profoundly dynamic universe. And it raises questions to people who want to see it as God made it perfect and that's how it is. Why is it changing if God made it perfect to start with?
Right.
It raises all kinds of theological questions. And I will tell you, I did not used to be interested in science and religion because I didn't see a problem. And then as I got more engaged, you realize that the two do challenge each other in ways that we should think about.
Personally, we know that year and month are somewhat astronomically created.
Yep.
But week always bothered me. Why was it written that God created the earth in 7 days? Why not 10? Why, 10 is real easy to count. Why was it written that it was 7? And I haven't read this anywhere, but I finally realized, to me, the answer was involved in the names of the days. Sun day, then moon day. Okay, the others are named after our Nordic gods.
Nordic gods.
But there are 5 other days, and there were 5 other astronomical things that moved from constellation to constellation. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. 1 day for each. And until the telescope was used, Uranus was eventually discovered, but that was thousands of years after the tradition of 7-day week.
And the Nordic gods, of course, didn't actually influence Genesis 1, but there is a lovely book, it's called The 7 Pillars of Creation by Bill Brown, who is a Bible scholar in Virginia. Good guy. And it looks at 7 of the creation stories in the Bible and looks at them against science. He took a year's sabbatical to do it because he had to study some of the science to be able to do it. But he points out that Genesis 1 is in historical criticism's terms, is the work of the priestly writer, as opposed to the Yahwist who's more earthy, who wrote Genesis 2, or at least edited Genesis 2. And if you read Genesis 1, you can link it not just to the need to go to worship on the 7th day, and temple rituals, but you can actually associate it with different parts of the temple and different parts of Jewish ritual. So he believes that Genesis 1 was written the way it was to kind of reinforce priestly ritual and priestly timetables. The priestly writer, after all. So again, these are theological ideas, they're liturgical ideas, they're religious ideas being expressed through adaptations of what was the best cosmology of the time, but we'll use it to tell a theological story.
So why didn't Ben Sawyer tell me about you earlier? Thank you so much for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes.
So almost a third, you know, about the age of the universe. But I'm
various days, but why don't you come over and or you give me a call. Yeah, whatever. Get the video, doesn't matter. Whatever. That sounds good. But you can give me a call. Sure. Yeah, I'm thinking maybe next Sunday or opening hymn will be.
Oh, yeah, right by the start.
And
And if you go a little further, you go to the fireworks place, or the Halloween place.
Nothing, that's just it.
yeah, the
No,
science class that
I think
Anna and I
they
teach, and then
just-
she teaches
it's
a couple of others, they're all electives, but the idea of this American Academy of Science.
Really mind-boggling.
There's a number of us, including Bill Brown,
I think it's,
is to think about integrating some of this more into the sort of standard.
there's a woman
So
minister,
that
he
even
likes her
people who
very
don't think they're
much.
interested in this get at least a
I don't
taste
know.
of it.
I mean, he loves Quincy. Well, he's saying he doesn't like the whole Jesus thing.
fellow who wasn't here today, he would have,
He thinks.
I'm gonna write to him, well, if his wife,
Yep.
the blonde lady in the back,
Okay.
doesn't tell him first,
His
has written a book about Newton,
And so,
and his religious ideas,
Yeah.
and,
It's not somewhat weird.
yes,
yes,
exactly.
well,
And
his whole life is very interesting.
Yes, in many, many, many ways.
And his views on the
You
Trinity
can do whatever you want.
and things of that sort.
No, I,
Drives me, no, this is just the last.
This is yours,
Yes, thank
and
you.
this is not.
5 years or whatever, since he's been doing all this research. It all started with that Nicene, yes. Because of reverence and that it was,
yes, but,
and the translation of
Yes.
the words were not
that goes back to
exactly
Newton, that goes
accurate,
back to
yes,
Newton,
the whole thing.
right, and
You
then
know,
when
and
you got
to
into
me,
Newton.
yeah, to me,